You are listening to Leading the Factory Forward with your host, Lynn Friest. We share interviews with manufacturing experts and strategies for embracing the digital future, recruiting a new workforce, finding new business. Lynn is an advanced manufacturing strategist and leadership consultant who is on a mission to show manufacturing leaders how to improve their current operations while preparing for a digital future. And here's your host, Lynn Friest.
Welcome to Leading the Factory Forward, the podcast to help you grow and develop as a manufacturing leader. In this post, I want to share 6 ideas that will improve your conversations in your meetings as a leader and help you really move your business ahead. The 6 ideas that we're going to talk about today are: a meeting is a series of conversations. Have an agenda for your meetings. Is it safe to speak in your meetings? Do you have a process for your meetings? Is there a next step at the close of your meetings? And finally, a few quick notes on virtual meetings. Again, in this session, I'm going to be using a lot of the ideas that come from a great teacher and a friend of mine of many years, Paul Axtell. And I will include links to his book, Meetings Matter, at the end of the show and in the show notes. Paul begins his book by saying the first step is to take the perspective that your conversations and your meetings matter. He goes on to say, meetings are at the heart of an effective organization, and each meeting is an opportunity to clarify issues, set new directions, sharpen focus, create alignment, and move objectives forward. So some more notes about meetings is conversation is how we make meaning for ourselves. It's how we actually prepare ourselves to take action. Meetings are also one of the most expensive things that your organization does. Just consider how many people and how much their time is worth and how much time they spend in meetings. A lot of your time and money is devoted to meetings. Just consider, do we truly have meetings? Or are sometimes we just getting together to work on email and we pretend to have a meeting? Since many meetings are so bad, if you can learn to hold remarkable meetings, you may also become known as a remarkable person in your organization, and certainly you can lead your organization to new heights or performance with effective meetings. Again, if you are known to have quick-paced, rapid meetings that get things done, it can certainly set you apart, both with your employees and the people you serve as customers. Having effective meetings is very much a learnable skill, and with practice, you can become very successful at it. For example, the importance of meetings was illustrated in work I had once where I was at the factory. I had the opportunity to be at both the factory manager's level as well as talking with people on the shop floor. Those people who were on the factory manager's staff and at that level had a lot of time to have discussions and meetings about what a new initiative meant or what change was going to happen. But then as the information cascaded down through the organization, from manager staff to business unit leaders down to supervisors and people on the shop floor, there was less time for them to actually have conversation and understand these initiatives, so their understanding was much weaker. So I offer this as just an example of how people make meaning through meetings and conversations and how it's important to your business to be as effective as possible on those. So now we'll move on to our 6 items. The first one, a meeting is a series of conversations. Again, in Paul's book, he talks about 3 key areas of a conversation. Is there clarity? Have people understood what you said? Have you understood what they said? Is there candor? And we'll talk again about this later. Is there a safe place so that people can really express themselves? Is there a commitment? Have people at the end of your conversation or meeting decided, yes, this is something that will happen. I will commit to doing this. And finally, is there completion? Again, that can be related to commitment. On the other hand, it's also, is there understanding? And are people complete? Do they agree with the decision? Are they ready to go to the next thing? So some of the ideas in thinking about these conversations is, what topics do you intend to cover in the meeting? Can you set the meeting up as a specific set of conversations and think about it that way? Can you ask the meeting participants to follow a process? Again, because this will be something new for them. They're often not used to having a process. You may have to go ahead and ask their permission to actually use a reasonable process for your meeting. Now, again, just as a perspective, Douglas Stone in Difficult Conversations said, difficult conversations are almost never about getting the facts right. They're about conflicting perceptions, interpretations, and values. And again, while this applied to difficult conversations, it also applies to meetings. Usually we're really focused on getting the facts right or having the PowerPoint, but really it's about perceptions, interpretations, and values is where the meat of a great effective meeting comes. So when we don't have these things, what are the pain points? What happens when it's missing? Meetings can jump forward and backward and all over the place if conversations are not focused. The meeting can also get lost on a tangent that has nothing to do with the topics intended to be covered. So what are just a couple of the first steps you can take as far as designing your meeting or thinking about your meeting? Practice closing conversations. This can be either checking for agreement or understanding or really defining what's the next step, who's committed to do something by when. And finally, in your meetings, hold people to one conversation at a time. Often there are side conversations. The conversations wander off track. Just gently pull people back saying, this is the conversation we're having at this time. The next item we want to talk about is simple, but often not done well, is have an agenda. As you design your meetings, think about a quote from Margaret Wheatley. What matters and who cares with respect to this meeting? Have we got the right people there, and are we covering the right pieces of work? You also probably want to limit the topics to be covered. What's the really key purpose of this meeting? You won't cover everything, and often we pack our agendas with way too many things. Who really needs to be at this meeting, and what will they contribute? We often have hosts of people coming to meetings, and they're not even sure why they're there. Next, is there anything needed to prepare people for the meeting? Is there a context that you need to set in the invitation, or is there information that you can provide them ahead of time? Another thing, again, to show how you're different from others is consider having a 45-minute meeting and being very specific that that's what you're doing. Also, if it's really just check-ins, consider holding a stand-up meeting. Finally, to start a meeting, sometimes just to warm things up, you could do a quick check-in with each person sharing just one thing. An example of a question I've seen before is, what's top of mind? Just getting, again, people used to participating in the meeting. So what happens when the agenda isn't present, when it's missing? Well, with another thing, we've mentioned earlier some of the problems, but also without an agenda, it's hard for people to know what to expect, or even if they should even be there. What are the first couple of things you can do about having better agendas? Really think about what are the outcomes you want from a meeting and from the specific conversations in that meeting. If you have a lot of information sharing going on, those big PowerPoints, well, maybe send it ahead of time. People may or may not review it, but again, try to set the context for the meeting. And that gets back to when you actually start the meeting, set it up. What are we going to do? As I said earlier, maybe ask permission to focus on one conversation at a time, or the fact that you will have specific conversations on the different topics in the meeting. The next idea is it's safe to speak. And we've talked this earlier in conversations. We've talked about this in difficult conversation, but the idea still holds true. Again, repeating Google's Project Aristotle for high-performing teams, psychological safety was critical in terms of high-performing teams. And also, was there relative equal opportunity to speak? So again, keep this in mind. You're trying to have a safe space for people to really contribute in the meeting. You also want to be gracious. I mean, there will be people who go off topic. There will be people who throw in extra things or non-relevant comments, but be gracious. Pull it gently back into the topic that you're discussing. Also, take notice of the people that aren't participating and invite people into the conversation, because sometimes, again, it's the idea people may not feel they've got something, but you may miss out on some great ideas. So be intentional about inviting people into the conversation. And then as you go through, check with people for understanding. There are some pain points when it's missing. You can have very little participation. We've all experienced that in our meetings. And if people are confused or unclear, that's even less likely that they'll participate. And then sometimes meetings can be dominated by those who are most aggressive or most passionate speakers. So again, don't want to lose out on people who are possibly less aggressive in presenting their ideas. So what are some of the first steps in creating safety? Set up the meeting's purpose and explain what conversations you want to have. As I said earlier, have people understand what's going to happen next, and explain how you will facilitate the meeting and manage the conversations so that people are comfortable that, hey, this is actually going to be different than maybe. And then finally, be sure to be distinctive about closing and moving on to the next conversation, but asking people, are they finished? Are they ready to move on? In our next item, do you have a process for your meetings? And again, a meeting process is to provide guardrails and not a rigid sequence. It just helps people know what's coming next. Some example processes from Paul's book are 4 steps. What do we know about the situation? What options do we have? What risks need to be managed? Other thoughts on the issue. So that would be one simple 4-step process. A second one for a different kind of a meeting is, where is everyone on this idea? Let's break this issue into parts and explore those parts. Now let's come back to where are we at now on these ideas. And finally, anyone have thoughts on how to proceed? So again, just a couple of 4-step processes. I refer you to Paul's book for more examples and more details on that. If we don't have a process, the things that happen, people are interrupting and people are going off topic or onto tangents or they're talking over one another. So again, a process just helps everybody understand what's going to happen next and how can I participate. Paul suggests this general framework for any type of a meeting process. State the topic. What do you want to produce? How much time is needed for this topic? And you can explain to people what that might be. Define how you're going to talk through it and what happens next. So again, a simple 5-step set of questions you could think about as far as your meeting process goes. The next thing is at the close of the meeting, is there a next step? You want to go back and review conversations and their outcomes. You want to also check again for understanding. Has everybody understood what went on during this meeting? You want to thank people for their participation and contribution and acknowledge the value that they added. There, of course, may be topics that were not covered and need to be handled separately, so acknowledge that happened. You may not have covered all the topics, or there may have been extra topics introduced that you chose not to handle in this particular meeting. What happens when it's missing as far as a good close to a meeting? People leave without any idea or commitment to take any action, or no one knows who is going to take action, and consequently nothing happens. So what are a couple of the first steps you could take? Restate any action steps decided on in the agenda and confirm a delivery date for those. There may need to be some negotiation on commitments and due dates, depending as people have thought through things. And once again, ask for any questions or concerns about understandings or information that was shared in the meeting. Our final segment is just some special notes on virtual meetings. Virtual meetings are a little different because you don't always have the nonverbal cues that you can normally use to manage a meeting. So you have to be more explicit. You really need to actually call on people. And if you're having the meetings in English, and that is not the native language for some of the participants, it may be helpful to send out slides or information beforehand. I know a colleague from Germany said it helped him to review the information because he could translate it and then be prepared in the meeting to participate and not have to translate as the meeting unfolded. You want to test your technology. Sound quality can be very important in a virtual or a remote meeting. You may need to be prepared to mute people to avoid background noise, background interruptions going on, and then simply invite people to unmute when they want to speak. You could also set up your meeting and say, if there are tech failures, let people know what a recovery plan might be. So if they drop off the call or, what would be the next step so that people know ahead of time how you might make a recovery from anything that goes wrong with the technology. If some of these things are missing in the virtual meetings, people can easily be disengaged or marginalized and really not end up participating at all. And you're going to possibly miss out on great input if the remote people feel they can't be heard. So you really have to think about going back to call people specifically. Again, just in general, on virtual meetings, you have to be very much more intentional about managing conversations, be clear about what next steps are. You, as a leader, might have a list of attendees in front of you to remind you to call on people who may not have spoken in the meeting. Again, being mindful of language differences or technology issues. And in general, I would say just consider having a shorter agenda for remote meetings because it has to be much more intentional about what you cover and how you cover it. So just in summary, as we get to the close of this episode, our items that we covered were a meeting is a series of conversations. You need to have a good, solid agenda for your meeting. Is it safe to speak in your meeting? Have you set it up so there's psychological safety for the people who are there? And do you have a process for your meetings? Is there a thing that people can understand and be aware of what's going to happen next in your meeting? As you close the meeting, is there a next step? Is there commitments that have been made? Who has made those commitments and when are they going to deliver them? And finally, we covered just a few points on virtual meetings, and we'll probably cover virtual meetings in another episode down the road. So once again, I highly recommend the book Meetings Matter by Paul Axtell to go deeper into these ideas and understand that you can learn to hold remarkable meetings. And with that, you can create remarkable results for your organizations. So thank you for listening today. Our next episode is kind of a special episode. Again, this is a different book that Paul has published called 10 Powerful Things to Say to Your Kids. And we'll go over some of the ideas he has about how do we have effective conversations with our kids, whether they be young children or our teenagers. So look forward to talking with you next time. Thank you.